Good morning, friends. I kind of can't believe that I'm making this video. When I started this channel, I thought I would be talking more about my personal experience growing up as a rad-trad Catholic, but here we are. I, someone who is very much so not a scholar of the New Testament, am making a video where I am defending the majority scholarly opinion that the Gospels are anonymous. Let's begin. So why am I making this video? Well, Catholic YouTuber Kyle Whittington sent me a book. 4 books, actually. But we're going to start with The Case for Jesus by Brant Pitre. Chapter 2 in The Case for Jesus is called Were the Gospels Anonymous? And the chapter concludes, perhaps unsurprisingly since this is an apologetic work, that, quote, the theory of the anonymous Gospels fails, from page 23. In the intro, I said I would be defending the majority scholarly opinion that the Gospels are indeed anonymous. Well, how do I know that this is the consensus opinion? Well, I will quote a book called The Case for Jesus by Brant Pitre, chapter 2, page 13. By the end of the 20th century, the assumption that the 4 Gospels in the New Testament were not originally attributed to anyone was so widespread that it was rarely ever discussed. As an aside, you can tell that this is an apologetic work, not a scholarly work, by Dr. Pitre's use of the word assumption. Anyway, Dr. Pitre is Catholic, and the scholarly consensus is so wide that even the Catholic Encyclopedia is on board with the majority scholarly opinion. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the first 4 historical books of the New Testament are supplied with titles: the Good News according to, kata is the Greek word, Matthew, the Good News kata Mark, which, however ancient, do not go back to their respective authors of those sacred writings. The canon of Muratori, Clement of Alexandria, and St. Irenaeus bear distinct witness to the existence of those headings in the latter part of the 2nd century of our era. Indeed, the manner in which Clement and St. Irenaeus employ them implies that, at an early date, our present titles to the Gospels had been in current use for some considerable time. Hence, it may be inferred that they were prefixed to the evangelical narratives as early as the first part of the same century. However, they do not go back to the 1st century of the Christian era, or at least that they are not original, is a position generally held at the present day. So the majority scholarly opinion wins the debate via the argumentum ad populum, right? Oh wait, no, that's a fallacy. Okay, so the question that we should be asking then is, what is the basis for this very widely held view? In chapter 2 of The Case for Jesus, Dr. Brant Pitre sets up a few arguments for the anonymity of the Gospels, and then he rebuts them. I am going to respond in this video to just select parts of chapter 2, as well as parts that were not included in chapter 2 that really frankly should have been. The main argument that I'm going to be addressing is Dr. Pitre's claim that no anonymous manuscripts exist. On page 15, Brant Pitre says, no anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. While I'm tempted to say, technically they're all anonymous, since the actual text is anonymous and written in the 3rd person, and unlike the epistles, which contains authors' names, these are kata Matthew, not Matthew's good news. I'm not going to say that. At least not with full enthusiasm. Dr. Pitre is kind of correct in the sense that all of the manuscripts that we have found have had the traditional names attached to them. But that doesn't faze me in the slightest, for a few reasons. First, it is true that it was standard for historians to name themselves when they were writing histories, and it was especially normal for people to name themselves when they were writing letters. This is why the epistles mostly start with the authors naming themselves. Even 2 Peter, which I think is a super clear forgery, starts off with, hey, this is Peter. James starts off with, hey, it's me, James, brother of the Lord. And Jude starts with, this is Jude, servant of Jesus, brother of James. But those are letters, not histories, and I do think that a lot of conservative Christians want to say that the Gospels are more like histories than they are letters. So why don't we take a look at a couple histories from both before and after the period in which the Gospels were being written, and then see if the Gospels look like those histories. We will start with Herodotus's Histories, and Herodotus names himself at the very beginning of history. These are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians from losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were the grounds of feud. This was published around 430 BC. Note that it was written in the third person, but Herodotus does name himself. Thucydides likewise names himself at the beginning of History of the Peloponnesian War, still written in the third person, written around the 420s or the 410s BC. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. And now let's move to after the time of the Gospels being written. In Plotinus, the Enneads, written around 270 AD, the author lists himself like this: I myself, Porphyry of Tyre, was one of Plotinus's very closest friends, and it was to me he entrusted the task of revising his writings. So we have examples of historians both before and after the Gospels naming themselves. So we have tons of letters where people name themselves. And so sometimes the authors of the Gospel will point to Plato's work being anonymous, and that if we're going to doubt the Gospel's traditionally held authorship, then we should doubt Plato's scholarship or Plato's authorship. Michael Licona makes this argument, and while I do want to draw a distinction between historians and philosophers, I should also just say that we don't have any of Plato's writings. All we have is what other people have wrote down that Plato said. So nobody's actually claiming that we actually have any of Plato's own writings to begin with, and what we do have is just what other people said that Plato said. And if you want to argue that we should doubt that Plato did ever say those things, I'll say, sure. Anyway, Dr. Brant Pitre says that we should not think that the Gospels are anonymous because all of the manuscripts we have found have had the traditional authorship superscripts that we know and love today. Page 16 is a list of the manuscripts that purport to show that there was very early agreement and uniformity on the names of the Gospels. And this doesn't faze me either. First of all, the very first line on this table references the 2nd century manuscript Papyrus 4. Well, it turns out that Papyrus 4's date is not agreed upon, and Dr. Pitre is being pretty generous to himself with the date. While some scholars do put it at the very late 2nd century, some put it as late as the 4th century. And also, duh? We know that the names appear on the Gospels by the late 2nd century. Irenaeus was already calling the Gospels by their traditionally held names as early as 190 AD at the latest. And we have some evidence of Matthew and Mark being called their names even earlier than that, though that evidence is contested because it comes from Eusebius, and we've discussed how unreliable Eusebius can be in earlier videos. But okay, let's back up. Dr. Brant Pitre does not, at least not in chapters 2 or chapter 3, in the case for Jesus, put forward the most common argument for the anonymity of the Gospels, that the earliest church fathers, pre-190 AD, did not reference the Gospels by name at all. I'm going to quote an actual scholarly article, The Anonymity of the Gospels, Kata Pac-Man, by Daniel Ulici, published in 2019 in an Italian journal. This is an aside, but The Case for Jesus is a popular level work. And The Case for Jesus quotes other popular level works. For instance, it quotes and argues against Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God. If you're really interested in this stuff, you're better off going right to the scholarly works. Lots of them are available for free online anyway, like the one we're about to look at. The earliest apostolic fathers do not refer to individual gospels, but rather to what seems to be an undifferentiated mass of traditions about Jesus. For example, 1 Clement introduces quotes from the canonical Gospels with the phrase, "Remember the words of the Lord." 1 Clement 13:2. More tellingly, these authors often freely blend together different passages, sometimes from different Gospels. This suggests that they were working from a different text than what is now preserved in the canonical Gospels, or that they were conflating multiple texts in their memory. In either case, they do not cite any of their sources by name. This is apparent, for example, in 2 Clement 9:11 and 6:1, which combine elements from Matthew and Luke. The phenomenon is also present in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians 2:3-20. This pattern of quotation would support the idea that the Apostolic Fathers did not know the Gospels under their traditional names because that naming convention simply had not been invented yet. So Dr. Pitre's popular level work, The Case for Jesus, does not engage with this argument at all, at least not in chapters 2 and 3. It sets up a straw man with the manuscript table, and then it does an excellent job at knocking down that straw man. This is the main problem with popular level apologetic style works. They start with a conclusion and they reason their way back. To the Catholics in my audience, if you're interested in hearing which New Testament scholars who are Christian, who I actually greatly do respect, check out Mike Licona or Dale Allison. The further away from the apologetics industrial machine that you get, the better. And The Case for Jesus just isn't that far from the apologetics industrial machine. Sorry, Dr. Brant Pitre. At least my channel is way too small for you to ever actually see this. Argument number 2 that Brant Pitre makes in chapter 2, The Case for Jesus, is that the anonymous scenario is just incredible. I originally planned to make this video way longer, but when I saw how much I needed to do just to address the first few pages of chapter 2, I thought I better save that for another video. Dr. Pitre covers in the subsequent part of chapter 2 how, quote, incredible it would be for the Gospels to all wind up with the same names. Spoiler, it's frankly not that incredible, and the Gospels actually kind of didn't, at least not until after the 2nd century. If I make a video on this topic, I think I'll do a deep dive on the naming of the Gospel of John pre-2nd century, or pre the end of the 2nd century. And just one quick extra note, on page 13, Brant Pitre calls the theories of the Gospels being anonymous, quote, new, and says that it came about in, quote, the last century or so. I mean, I guess this all depends on what you mean by new, right? And I mean, it's closer to 2 centuries than it is 1. Here's an 1851 lecture given in England by a minister defending the traditional authorship view against this, quote, new idea that the Gospels were anonymous. That's 170 years ago. But maybe by new, we just mean new compared to the whole history of the Bible. I mean, the oldest Old Testament books were written as far back as like 800 BC. So, like, yeah, this theory of gospel anonymity is new compared to that. But like all biblical scholarship in general has only been around for, quote, the last century or so. Now, that's not exactly true. We can probably trace the origin of biblical scholarship back to the Enlightenment, when Spinoza was arguing that Moses wasn't actually the author of the Torah. That was like the 1600s, but biblical scholarship didn't begin in earnest until like the 1800s. All of this to say that I'm not really impressed by Brant Pitre calling it a, quote, new theory, and I don't think that being a new theory is a bad thing anyway. Okay, I'm done for now. Thanks for listening this far. And I probably lost most of you by now, especially the Catholics who are fans of The Case for Jesus. Sorry, guys. But I'm going to keep digging into the books that Kyle Whittington sent me. And this might take a while. So if you don't like this style of video, too bad. YouTube is my hobby, not my job. And I'm going to do whatever I want to do with my channel. I leaned heavily on, yes, the 4 Gospels were originally anonymous from the Dawson Jones blog. Though I never quoted it directly in this video, I did quote the same sources from the blog that the blog cited. I also leaned heavily on this debate between Dr. Robin Walsh and Jonathan Sheffield on Myth Vision podcast. And of course, I leaned heavily on the various works of Camille Gregor. In particular, I kept on returning to this Reddit thread and this YouTube stream on my YouTube. Thanks, everybody.